We have seen by the end of the 19th century increasingly unique and subjective approaches to creation, particularly in terms of painting. We really have been dealing in art and literature with forces of personal expression. We saw this in the post-impressionists, in particular Vincent van Gogh, and certainly in Paul Gauguin. We saw it in the work of symbolist artists, both those that painted in a more academic classical style such as Puvis de Chavannes and Gustave Moreau, and those who painted in more abstract styles such as Odilon Redon. So we've seen many changes. We've seen dramatic change at the end of the 19th century. The work, in fact, of some of the artists that we have talked about in relation to other movements, symbolism, post-impressionism, fits the definition of expressionism. And so I'm using expressionism with a lowercase e when I define Paul Gauguin as an expressionist, or when I define Vincent van Gogh as an expressionist. It's a term used to describe works of art with strong color or a degree of abstraction in which reality is distorted in order to express the artist's inner sensations or emotions. So that's expressionism with a lowercase e. There's also expressionism with a capital E that usually is specifically meant to describe German expressionism in the early 20th century. A number of artistic movements of the century, in fact, have been called expressionists. For instance, the first major American movement of the late 40s and early 50s is called abstract expressionism. But expressionism with an uppercase E typically is associated with German expressionism in the early part of the 20th century. But again, this word expressionism is an important one. It is one that can be applied to a number of artists, particularly the expressionism with a lowercase e. Two artists who are considered precursors of 20th century German expressionism are the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch and the Belgian artist James Ensor. Munch is spelled E-D, well, his first name is spelled E-D-V-A-R-D, Edvard, and Munch is capital M as in Mary, U-N-C-H, Edvard Munch. The Belgian artist who we will also look at as a precursor of expressionism is James Ensor, J-A-M-E-S, and capital E-N-S-O-R. They are contemporaries. Munch was born in 1863 and died in 1944. Ensor was born in 1860 and died in 1949. Now we're going to be leaving France. We're going to go to Norway and to Belgium to talk about these artists, but keep in mind that France, and specifically Paris, continues to dominate the artistic world, literally until World War II. And then everything shifts dramatically to New York. But these strong expressionistic currents and some very original art is produced outside of France, farther to the north and to the east. And I want to begin with Edvard Munch. Munch was a Norwegian, as I said, from what was considered a provincial country outside of the mainstream. In fact, until the beginning of the 19th century, Norway imported all of its artistic traditions and artists, and any native artists were often trained outside of the indigenous tradition. Munch wanted to establish a Norwegian artistic tradition, which in a sense he did. pretty much unique to himself, but strongly influenced by modern French painting of the late 19th century and by a Germanic concept which I will call angst, A-N-G-S-T, angst. Someone define angst?
Inner turmoil.
That's part of it. Someone Google it? Do we need to Google it? Go ahead.
Emotional distress.
Emotional distress. What else? Someone Googling it for us? Maybe we can get a direct translation. A-N-G-S-T.
Means fear or anxiety.
It means fear or anxiety. Yes. Fear. Munch began studying painting around 1880. He was trained in academic techniques at the only art school in Norway, the Royal School of Art and Design. And in 1885, he went to Paris, where he was to be strongly influenced by modern art. By 1885, that's going to mean the Impressionists and, to some extent, the Symbolists. This work dates to 1890. That's about 5 years after he first went to Paris. It's called The Night in St. Cloud. It's a modest work. It's about 25 inches in height. And it's an interesting work because it has a kind of impressionist pastel-y palette, a sense of light dissolving objects, but it has very dark, ominous overtones. Impressionist subjects were usually rather lighthearted, not serious. Remember, genre subjects, scenes of boating, scenes of genre. But here we have something that is additionally kind of haunting and symbolically suggestive. And that's not what the Impressionists were intent upon doing. So he's taken this knowledge of an Impressionist palette, and he's moving in the direction of defining his own unique style of art. The mood was probably set by a personal tragedy which marred his life. He had just learned about the death of his father. Now, this is tragic for any child, but actually he hadn't gotten along with his father at all, so then you're very conflicted. So who is the man in the top hat in what looks like a waiting room? So again, that's kind of symbolic right there. Who's looking out a window at a port. We look like we see perhaps a boat or buoys lighted up in the distance. He's a featureless figure composed of darker browns and blacks in this sort of brighter purple and pinkish and bluish space. You'll notice that the window elements here actually create a reflection on the floor of this waiting room. And what does that reflection make? What symbol? The cross, yes, the cross, casting a shadow on the floor. This is a very introspective art. It is the art of someone who appears to be suffering, of someone who is fearful, perhaps. And this is very typical of Munch's art. He had, first of all, a very sad childhood. His mother died of tuberculosis, a symptomatically horrifying disease, and he was only 5 years old. His older sister also died of tuberculosis when he was 14. His family also had a history of mental illness. This is something that probably had affected his father, and that's why he was not able to interact easily with his father. Monk would later write, quote, "Two of humankind's most horrible enemies were granted to me as an inheritance of tuberculosis and mental illness." And I'm just thinking this might be a good quote, so let me repeat it. "Two of humankind's most horrible enemies were granted to me as an inheritance of tuberculosis and mental illness." Two of humankind's most horrible enemies were granted to me as an inheritance. He goes on to say, "Sickness and insanity are the black angels that guarded my crib. A mother who died young, an overly nervous father, so pietistically religious as to be almost insane. The descendant of an ancient family, giving me the seeds of insanity." Themes of death and spiritual violation and fear are recurrent in Monk's art. This is a very famous painting called The Chamber of Death. Increasingly, by the end of the 19th century, artists have moved away from the tradition of naturalism, the tradition of the Renaissance window on reality. We can see the way the space has been compressed here, the way the figures have been simplified, and the way he is honing in on their personal internal feelings. You notice that we don't actually see who's dying, right? Because one of the first things that I assume that you did is you looked at the bed, because first of all, the greenish-white sheets draw you there, because it's a very bright area. And then you realize, well, there's no one under the covers. There isn't a head on the pillow. And you realize, oh, this person has gotten out of bed and actually seated in a chair. And that's probably not because they're getting any better, because he doesn't look like he thinks they're getting any better. As he faces and sort of this older bearded man and puts his hands together. We see in the emotions of all of the figures in this room a sense of hopelessness and despondency, from the loss of color in the face of this woman who's almost ghost-like, to figures who turn away or turn their heads down. This is, I don't know how much more depressing this painting could possibly be. Notice, very interesting, this room is completely claustrophobic. There is not a door indicated. There is not a window. There is no way to escape. So in a sense, it's reminding us of our own mortality. In a sense, it could be symbolically saying this entire family is destined to die, sort of in a tomb here symbolically. The lack of traditional modeling of the forms, the flattened perspective that I talked about previously, the abstraction indicates clearly Monk's knowledge of Van Gogh, of Gauguin, of French symbolism, and the technique of the synthetist painters who were flattening and painting in flat areas of color. There's also the use of complementary colors to some degree here. In this work that tend to fight each other for dominance, and that's something we saw in post-impressionist work as well. Monk said, quote, "I shouldn't like to be without suffering. How much of my art I owe to suffering." Again, quote, "I shouldn't like to be without suffering. How much of my art I owe to suffering." Perhaps an even more overtly symbolic painting, but one that almost slaps you in the face here, is this one called Evening on Karl Johan Street in Oslo. 1893 is the date. Again, despite the fact that you have here a street and a sense of perspective of moving back into the distance with the buildings, there's a very strong sense of compression. In fact, we as the viewers, all right, are also someone walking on the street. And if we're on the street and we're standing here, how are you feeling about that? What's your feeling if you're standing here looking straight ahead?
You're against the crowd.
You're going against the crowd. You're going to be crushed. And these don't look like friendly people either. So there's no one in this group except you see the small head with a hat here on the right-hand side, and maybe some people trying to pass over to the left. But the crush is coming straight forward, and again, there are these ghost-like, unreal faces. However, there is one person who got outside of this crowd and is walking the other way. You see that person in the street? So it's often thought that perhaps that's the artist. So again, symbolically pulling away from this great crowd of people crushing down on him and actually moving in the opposite direction. Alienation and anxiety, that's what we see represented here. And it's interesting that these are frequent themes in expressionistic art in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that's with a lowercase e so that we can include a lot of different artists. In fact, Edvard Munch's art affords glimpses of the depths of human psychosis, even prior to the widespread knowledge of psychoanalysis as being developed by the Austrian scientist Sigmund Freud. Freud was born in 1856 and died in 1939. He first published at the end of the century, beginning with a work called Studies in Hysteria, 1895. Psychology and psychoanalysis attempted to explain human behavior. And for Freud, the deeply emotional conflicts which we experience are often repressed into the subconscious mind, and it all centers around what? With Freud. Sex. Sex. All centers around sex. Whether it's the relationship of the child to the parent, or to adults, to each other. Edvard Munch remained a bachelor throughout his life, and very little is known about his personal relationships with women. But we know that when his brother, Andreas, died at a young age in 1895, Andreas had only been married for about 6 months, and Munch was said to have remarked bitterly that his brother should never have married. And he took up the theme of the femme fatale. So he saw that, in a sense, that his understanding of what happened to his brother was the sexual relationship and the potential for death that he saw in that relationship. In this painting, we see an extraordinary work by Edvard Munch, again from around 1893. Where the story really revolves around many different possible scenarios, but also it's very much based in our basic sexuality. It's called puberty. And we see a nude, adolescent young girl, pretty girl. She's seated on a bed, but she doesn't look very comfortable. So it's as though there's someone in the room with her, perhaps, who is looking at her. She's very uncomfortable, clearly without her clothes on. She's staring out. She tries to hide part of her body by holding her arms very self-consciously in front of her, particularly hiding her pubic area. She represents for Edvard Munch the reality of sexuality, combined again with the knowledge that once you reach puberty and you become a sexually active human, that the next great stage of life is really to reproduce and then geriatrics, then to die, basically. And so it is an extraordinary time in life. To further emphasize that potential meaning, there's a very ominous-looking shadow. I mean, I don't know what to call it. What do you think? That literally looks as though it's coming off of her body from one side. It's very strange. Some critics have described the shadow as a blatant phallic symbol. In any case, it's a powerful work. It's a highly expressionistic work filled with that angst, that fear of life and experiences of life that Munch puts into the creation of this young woman. The work of Edvard Munch serves as a major source of inspiration for 20th century abstraction because his work will become very well known to German expressionist artists in the early 20th century. That to a large extent because he also made prints based on most of his paintings, and these are highly disseminated in Europe. Any questions? I have to tell you about 15 years ago, could have been more than that, there was a major Munch retrospective, and it came to a museum in Southern California, in Orange County. I literally could not get myself to go, because looking at one Munch is one thing, but looking at a retrospective of maybe 20 paintings, I mean, the depression, the overwhelming sense of despair when you would come out of that show. Is that crazy? Yes, it is crazy.
Aren't they selling one right now?
Did they not sell a Munch recently?
They're selling one right now.
I know that the Scream was stolen, or a version of the Scream was stolen, but so find out and tweet about it. James Ensor is the other precursor of Expressionism in the 19th century. He's a Belgian, born in Belgium in 1860, raised in the port city of Ostend, O-S-T-E-N-D, where his mother ran a souvenir shop filled with toys and carnival masks and knickknacks from all over the world, which clearly had a profound impact on a little boy who grew up in this sort of souvenir shop filled with all of these fantastical, strange, unusual, and wonderful objects. That is one way, I suppose, to explain an aspect of Edvard Munch in the Self-Portrait with Masks, here from 1899. Ensor, like Munch, was preoccupied with the reality of death. This fascination was combined with a fascination for dream imagery and anything in life that was bizarre or strange. In a sense, the Self-Portrait with Masks is Ensor's response to the work by Munch that we just looked at of An Evening on Karl-Johann-Strasse, in which Munch shows himself alienated from the rest of the crowd, But it's very, very different, as you can see, stylistically. It's almost amusing. It's almost, there seems to be a little bit of humor here, although I have to say this man was a thorough misanthrope. But it is different in terms of its depression from a monk. I don't know if it's the bright color, despite the fact that we're looking at some very kind of unusual, ghastly-looking masks here. But there is that sense of isolation that we saw in the monk. Ensor's career began with much more conservative paintings than that late self-portrait. He attended the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. He showed works in the official salon. And in fact, this work dates to 1882. This is an early work in his oeuvre. And it looks very much like a French Impressionist work in the sense that the subject matter is a woman who's dining at a table. I mean, there are Renoirs that look somewhat similar to this, or Degas. And she is enjoying herself there as she eats oysters. But the work is also interesting in terms of, is there a kind of undercurrent of what's going on here? And what I mean by that is, here's someone who's seated. There's a large plate of oysters in front of her. You look at the table. There are bottles there, carafes, other glasses and plates. Do you wonder who else was sitting there, or who else is supposed to be sitting there? Does that bother you at all, that there's no one else there? And she's just kind of going for it. She's eating all of the oysters. So there's something about it that, is symbolically kind of provocative that, again, you're not going to get in an Impressionist painting. It's suggestive of something else, something that maybe would be disturbing if we knew more about it. But this is a conservative work. When we start to look at the works that develop subsequently, and this is about 1 year later. This is called Scandalized Masks. And we've moved very far away from that very polite middle-class woman eating oysters to some very strange-looking people. This work in 1883 seems to be the first time that masks are introduced into his art. As we saw in his self-portrait from 1899, they literally start to take over. But here we see masks. The masks are worn by the protagonists. Here, a big nose mask here on someone who's wearing a hat. And I have to tell you, the proportions and a sort of oversized overcoat make you think that this is Ensor as a child, perhaps, representing himself. Here you can't tell, or perhaps a very old, small man. And then there's a woman coming in the door into this very drab room. You can see the light from a lamp in the upper left-hand corner, which creates very bright yellow background, a flat kind of background or wall. The figures in what we should describe as carnival masks, the kinds of masks sold by his mother in her shop, look as though they didn't expect to see each other. And we wonder, well, what's going on? What's the confrontation here? The source of inspiration may well be in one of the clues here. There's a bottle, a wine bottle. I don't see a glass, but there may be a small cup. It may be somewhat difficult to tell because of the dark tabletop. So it would appear then that the seated figure, the male figure, has been drinking. And then you have the female figure who enters. We know that Munch's father was an alcoholic and that he endured that alcoholism throughout his childhood, and that what he also endured was either his mother or his grandmother screaming at his father for his drinking. And so everyone becomes a kind of hideous mask in this relationship. There's a wonderful kind of moment of when they're stunned. They seem to be immobile because they didn't expect to see each other. The woman having opened the door, the man sitting at this table facing the door. I mean, it is basically facing the door so he could see who comes through with his bottle there. The use of masks juxtaposed with what would have been an everyday situation. Take the masks off, and you have either a little boy or an old man sitting at a table and a woman coming through the doorway. All right? Take the masks off. There's not much going on in terms of the interaction. But putting the masks on disassociates everything from reality. I mean, again, this is 1883. It's very hard, willing suspension of disbelief, because we're in 2012 and nothing shocks you anymore. But think about it in the context of the works that we've looked at thus far. The critics didn't appreciate Ensor's work. They called his paintings visions, which are among the most ridiculous and terrifying. In 1883, Ensor was one of the founders of Les Vins, which we talked about before. You remember Les Vins is written XX, Roman numeral 10, Roman numeral 10, and vin in French, V-I-N-G-T, is 20. So Les Vins is the 20, referencing the number of artists who organized this artists group. The goal was to promote new and innovative art. But even this liberal organization became increasingly critical and openly hostile to Ensor's work. Ensor chose to paint religious subjects and to treat them in a highly subjective, very insulting way. Images of Jesus and the devil became metaphors for the artist and for his suffering. Well, that's nothing new. We saw that with Paul Gauguin, if you remember, and that's something that we know the artist as the individual in society who suffers because others do not understand him. This is Ensor's own sense of persecution coming out in terms of his identification with Christ. His most famous work is the entry of Christ into Brussels in 1889. Now listen to this. It was painted in 1888. He's painting the second coming. The entry of Christ into Brussels in 1889, painted a year earlier in 1888. This is a huge painting. It's over 8 feet 5 inches in height and more than 12 feet wide. And this painting is owned by the Getty. And this is the painting that I'm going to send you to see. And I want to just talk about it here a little bit. You can see there's plenty in this painting for you to look at, and it's particularly wonderful to see it in person. By the way, the last time I was there, last time I saw it, they still did not allow any photographs. So even without flash, they don't allow you to photograph it. So. This work, The Entry of Christ into Brussels in 1889, was refused admission to the group show of Les Vins. Now, wait a minute. Ensor organized that group. He was one of the inaugural members. But they refused to show it. And it was not publicly exhibited until 1929. He kept it. It's a complicated painting iconographically, though it contains many of the masks and the bizarre figures that we are familiar with from having seen other of his macabre works. Represented is a carnival in Brussels. And carnival, of course, follows the period of Lent in the Catholic Church when you give up something And then you celebrate at the end with this great carnival. That's what Mardi Gras is in New Orleans. All kinds of unusual people are represented, and because it's carnival, it's not so unusual that they are dressed up or that they are wearing masks. But they seem to be moving in sort of a very condensed crowd, and again, moving forward into our space in parade-like fashion, led by a very strange-looking character here at the front, who looks like he leads a marching band. Now, it's called The Entry of Christ into Brussels. It looks like there are politicians giving speeches. There are clowns who are entertaining. Where is Christ? If this is his parade, where is he? In the middle, right here. On an ass, on a donkey here. Here's Christ. You can see his halo. So could we say that he's the focus of the painting? Or he's just kind of an added element here? He's tiny. He seems unimportant in the context of such a huge painting with so many figures. And what's very interesting is, even though he's marching in the parade here, no one's really paying any attention to him. There are no spectators who seem to be celebrating him. All of the people who march in the parade are in front of him. They don't seem to be making space for him, perhaps, to come forward. He's one of them, or he's just being completely ignored. Even in some cases, perhaps scorned by the crowd. And this, of course, is how Ensor sees himself. So again, that idea of the Christ figure. Lurking among the masks at the very front of the picture plane is Death. Death is wearing a top hat that has some green on it. That's Death on the left-hand side. You see him? So again, constantly reminded of that fear of death. It is said that some of the figures are portraits. There are some ladies who are close to the podium where the clowns and the politicians are located. I just said clowns and politicians. And they may be his mother and his grandmother, and they would be present as well. Let me go back. So I'm not going to do Art Nouveau. I wanted to point out something, and I thought I had a detail of it, but I don't. And it's very hard, actually, to get good reproductions of this painting. This is not particularly good. It just kind of gives you a visual sense of it. So I want you to notice this banner here. Maybe it should say, "Welcome, Christ," or, "Second Coming," or something to that effect. But it says, "Vive la sociale." Vive, long live the socialist state. In huge letters. What we're seeing here is reference to contemporary politics in the banner that's represented here. So again, it's a kind of political rally. It's a rally where people with different points of view are carrying their banners. And again, all of them seeming oblivious to the entry of Christ. The last 20 years of the 19th century were filled with social upheaval, anarchy, and unnerving change. Karl Marx's Das Kapital was published in 1867. And the theories of socialism provoked many people to try to change the material situation of a large majority of people in Europe, the poverty-stricken working classes. Ensor has painted a work dealing with the laboring classes coming out to demonstrate. And he's entitled it, The Entry of Christ into Brussels. The technique of painting is also very important here, and you cannot see it in any reproduction very well, although I think there's some sense of it here, and that's the heavy impasto, I-M-P-A-S-T-O. The paint is applied very thickly and very spontaneously, and the color range is very discordant, complementary colors right next to each other to kind of shock the eye. And in fact, his technique was one of the primary reasons the work was refused exhibition. I'm not sure that if he had painted this in an academic classical style, it would, in terms of its subject matter, have been admitted. But all of those things coming together caused it to be rejected. Ensor finally won acclaim and respectability at the beginning of the 20th century, although his most creative period had passed, and he simply repeated old motifs. But he remained very attached to the entry of Christ. He kept it hanging on the wall of his studio in his house, and here I have the date. It was sold to the Getty in 1988. What I don't have is the price that was paid for it, so that's something else you could tweet as part of your 144 characters. So, Munch and Ensor reflecting on the strong current of personal expressionism at the end of the 19th century. Now, this slide shows you the term L'Art Nouveau being. And what I want you to do for Art Nouveau, which is also an international style of art, is to look at the video which I created, the Captivate video that I created that's on our class website. And you'll be able to look at the images as much as you want to. So be sure that you look at this, all right? And this will be included on test number 3.